So when I was first asked to do this keynote, I was thinking I was going to go all personal and talk about the very first days of PLOS. And several people here remember those very first days, and maybe with some fondness and maybe with less fondness, I'm not sure. I'm looking around to see. But some of those things that we were dealing with at the very beginning, finding a vendor, and that was really great because I got to meet some people that have continued to be good colleagues and friends since that time. So John Walensky was somebody that we looked at, whether we were going to use OJS, which was a very, very new platform at the time. Heather Joseph was at Bio1 at the time, and they were using Allen Press, who we ended up going with. And that's how I know Heather, was as a recommendation for the vendor that we ended up with. So, long, very interesting conversations that we've had for a long time now. And also, things like setting what's now iconic price point of $3,000 for an APC. If anyone wants to ask how we did that, that was more like this than a reality thing, but I'm happy to explain that. And then there also are going to a variety of conferences, and really, I'm sure Mark and Katrina and some other people really remember, it was a little chilly sometimes to go there. And so to be in a room now filled like this with friendly people is an amazingly wonderful thing. I'm not going to name names about what any of those conferences were, nor any of those people, but it's really great to see that's been a great dramatic change that's happened. And then also, this tweet was what I sent some vintage, we only made 15 of these shirts. I sent one to Allison Muddett when she became the CEO of PLOS. And I think Allison is also a really great example of somebody whose trajectory has kind of followed the arc from going from traditional subscription publishing. So she was at Blackwell, at Sage, then at University of California Press, and now at PLOS. And I think that's also a very nice arc. So like I said, I was going to go all personal, but instead I decided to go meta. So, so the rest of my talk is not going to be about any of those things. You will have recognized within the title of my talk a reference to T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men, and I think this captures very well some of the things that I think about where we are right now with the open access movement, which is somewhere between the idea and the reality, motion and act, conception and creation, emotion and response, and so on. So keep that in mind as we're going forward. So the idea to which my title refers is one that Jean-Claude has already mentioned, where he started to quote, an old tradition and a new technology have converged to make possible an unprecedented public good, the opening line of the BOAI from 2002. So, this seemed like a really simple idea, like new technology, going to take advantage of this and make everything free and available. And the reality, though, is still this one, which is the invitation for governments and universities and libraries and journal editors and publishers and foundations and so on to come together and make everything available. So it's still what we're trying to do, still trying to bring together all these groups to work together, to join together. And others that also were not listed here. So software and platform developers, and really looking forward to hearing Kristen later today and in her keynote talk about those software platform developers. Yes, there's been a lot of progress. I don't want this to sound like, after this is going to be this is my happy slide, and then after that, pfft. But anyway, if you're taking a look at this and you don't see your logo, I apologize. I could only fit so many logos on a slide, and this is more representative of the governments, universities, libraries, journals, publishers, foundations, learned societies, professional associations, software and platforms, and so on. So again, if you're not there, just consider yourself to be there. But, and this is, I have a friend who says everything important comes out after the but. So this is quite often the world, I think, in which we live, which is butting heads, turf wars, and so on, where we're not working together. We all have an interest in open access, but we're not necessarily working together. And quite often that becomes pitting business models against each other and whether one is superior or not, and all kinds of discussions that we're still having. And so after 10 years of OASPA, as we heard even yesterday, disparate can't necessarily even come to agreement as to how to make policy and advocacy statements. And this is the world in which I think we live and are currently existing. So why are we in this? Why are we in this? So I want to tell a little story, once upon a time story. Again, from my experience in the last, not just 10 years, but about 15 years in open access publishing. Going back to the very beginning, which I said we were going around, we were having conversations at a bunch of conferences, and these were the things that were being said about open access publishing. It doesn't have peer review, it's got poor editorial oversights, it's, shoddy production values, and I'm a production person, so shoddy production values? That is vanity publishing. Now I'm going to say that has now been recast as predatory, and I'm happy in the Q&A to explain what I think about predatory publishing, but you'll notice it's sitting here in what I'm calling a myth, and I have reasons that I think that. That there was, that if you didn't have paper, it was a poor quality. At PLOS, we actually published a lot on paper at the very beginning, even though we were an open access publisher whose whole mission was to be online and make this, freely available online. We strongly felt that, at least in the beginning, in order to be real, you had to be in print. And now that paper's pretty much gone away, it's still the perception, and this is especially true in humanities, among humanists, but it's in paper, so that makes it legit. They haven't been to a library in a long time, but so to know that paper is pretty much not existent. Still is a little bit, but that whole poor quality. Inferior content, and that whole open access thing, it's a naive business model, it'll never fly. These were the things that were being told 10 years ago. And now that so many of us have been working in open access, this is still what we hear. This was great marketing by a lot of publishers to get, and this, I hear this from scholars and researchers all the time. These very things, these are what people are still saying now. Great marketing, but now when you're trying, as one of those publishers who were making these statements, now trying to now say, oh, but wait, open access isn't like that. We're living with this. So these myths persist. It's also been combined with a bit of wishful thinking, I'm going to say, by my library colleagues. And One is that open access was going to be the solution to the cereals crisis. It has not turned out, for any number of reasons, to be the case, and probably wouldn't be the case, I would say. There's also a perception that production costs are all that matter, and again, I'm a production person, so, but we know that there's a lot more that goes into publishing than production, and production is actually not the expensive part of publishing. It's all that other non-production work. So trying to reduce something to how much did it cost to produce it is a very difficult calculation. That if we make faculty aware, then they'll change their practices. If we just tell them, open access is good, keep your rights, do all the things that we're trying to say, then they'll do this. I think that's been a great frustration to many of my colleagues. And finally, that if we have institutional repositories and open access resolutions, this will be a great success. And I think all of us who've worked in repositories for a long time know that it's not such a great success. So, and I'm not saying these aren't important things, but again, it's wishful thinking that is persisting. That means that people are not necessarily moving to think about how things could be different. And then there's this, our own special language. This whole Libra, gratis, gold, platinum, green, it doesn't mean anything to anybody outside of this conversation. This is like when Danny was saying, I can't even remember the terms that she uses, I'm going, real language, like where am I? There we go. That starts to get to, maybe people understand what open access is. I mean, we could step back from there. But this whole special language that we use, this is code, and it doesn't mean anything to the vast majority of the researchers, scholars, and administrators that we're trying to talk to. So I'm going to urge some, just like real language. So all of this is combined, the wishful thinking and the myths and the secret society codes, and makes it very hard for people to come together. Again, when what we're talking about is how to make the business of open. And the world is going on while we're having this whole conversation. So I'd like to just go with a metaphor if I could, or maybe a historical precedent, which is the automobile industry. From the this postcard was created at about 1910. You'll see there are a mix of horses and cars. The very first car was built by Carl Benz in 1885. By 1908, the number of cars on the road surpassed the number of horses, 23 years. And after that, just exponentially, when the Model T came in and it became then affordable for people to buy cars, horses just, it's not like horses have gone away, but their impact on the streets has been very much limited. In those 23 years and then the years thereafter, there were a lot of people who lost their jobs. There were farriers and buggy whip makers and a number of people who, the ones who were left were in a niche industry, and there are still, blacksmiths and so on. But the vast majority of the people had to find some other things that they needed to be doing. So, let you think about that for a second. And here's why I think we're also in a transitional period where what happened 10 years ago was the excellent founding of OASPA. Also 10 years ago was the financial crisis of 2008. when Lehman Brothers collapsed and we had a whole discussion about who's too big to fail. So in the last 10 years, we've also had, sure, the stock market has come back a bit and there's been some recovery. But a lot of things have changed and continue to change that make it very difficult to predict what's going to be happening. But I tell you, we're right at a cusp, and this is not a conversation that normally a lot of people within these publisher groups and even librarians are not really having these conversations about what is happening within higher education itself. So we can start with the macroeconomics of higher education and shifts in hiring patterns. More and more money is now being spent on higher education, and this changes the focus. So education not as a right, but as a privilege in the United States and now in the UK with charging tuition and so on, numerous people who are going into an enormous amount of debt in order to fund their education. When they get out, they're having an expectation of that they got something out of their education. And so this is now changing a lot of, whether it's their parents who are looking for a return on investment or they're looking themselves for some return or they want some ongoing lifelong learning skills and so on. This is really changing the way that universities think about who they're serving. And they're serving the students. And that then becomes much more about teaching and much less about research, even if you're at a research-intensive university. There's starting to be this shift. There's also more and more, fewer and fewer tenure-track positions and tenured positions and more adjuncts. 76.4% of all faculty members in the United States are adjuncts. Adjuncts teach a lot. They don't publish a lot. And this is an increasing trend. So that means there's going to be less and less, fewer and fewer people to produce less and less research. Also in 2017, at least in the United States, this was the first time in the post-World War II era that the federal government funded less than 50% of the research. So only 44% of the research was funded by the federal government. There is a decrease in research funding. That means fewer and fewer people are getting less and less money to produce less and less. Thank goodness for Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe and Go Europe. It's less happy on my side of the pond. There's also then evaluations that are starting to shift from being based on, not on output, but on impact and on learning outcomes. And again, this is part of there's not just the REF, but the TEF in the United States, one of the accrediting associations, Middle States Accrediting Association, which accredits most, if not all, of the Ivy League universities, plus most of the other colleges and universities from about Virginia to New York or so. They came out with new accreditation standards where research is mentioned once, and that's with grad students, and otherwise it's all about learning outcomes, which then it means as you're going for accreditation, what they're looking for is how are you doing on the teaching side, and not so much on the research side. And there's also a discussion about what counts and should count, and what forms those take, and whether if you're a public scholar, what that should look like. If you're on Twitter and you have a very strong Twitter presence, should that count as much as other kinds of publications? There are all kinds of conversations that are going on there. And that prestige is not necessarily as much of a driver as it used to be. Instead, faculty are spending a lot of time in the evaluation space talking about the productivity that they have in, academic insights or whatever the case may be. And so it's about, again, about impact and not necessarily about, and trying to judge what impact would be, and not necessarily about the output that you've done. So there's, connected to that are changes in tenure and promotion criteria. So even those with tenure, the conversation again is about the impact that they're having. Fewer and fewer pieces, maybe with greater and greater impact, would be better and better. There's also a great focus on public scholarship. This is a really good conversation for those of us who care about open access. Public scholarship is great. I mean, if what you're going to say is let's reward those things that are more and more open, then that really helps those of us who care about open access. And rewards for open can happen. There are already some conversations, good conversations that are happening. And because of the connection with lifelong learning possibilities, that's a clear win for administrators and so on when you say, hey, one way that we can create lifelong learners is when they get out of the university, they can have access to all the kinds of materials that they learned to love when they were in school. And administrators actually really understand that as a really compelling argument rather than a public good argument necessarily. And there's also a change in a better understanding of intellectual property. Because of the technology that we all carry around with us, whether people choose to respect intellectual property or not, they do understand that if they're going to Sci-Hub and they're downloading a bunch of stuff, they maybe shouldn't be doing that, but hey, it's so easy and I can do it. But it's a conscious decision that people are making rather than, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. But who owns what? That's going to be the crux. And another shift that is happening within universities is a discussion about taking back their own intellectual property. They're paying numerous people to do their jobs, of which part of their job is to publish. Why not? Now, there's the whole academic freedom conversation, which has also come up with Plan S. Increasingly, universities don't necessarily think that that's a good conversation to have. It's by tradition that people were allowed to keep their rights, and then what they did with them was generally sign them over. So what people really are now talking about is, do I, as the university, have prior claim, and then people can do whatever they want to. So MIT and Harvard in particular have gone that route. But it's starting to be, again, a big conversation that people are having. That does shift the conversations. And finally, technology. The BOAI declaration talked about technology, but what was technology in 2002? Cast your mind back. There was, browse. We didn't have any way to find content online. We had nothing. Now we have a mainframe computer in our pockets. That kind of firepower in our pockets. And that's going to continue to increase the kinds of technology and what we can do with technology, and that anybody can create, feature films on their phones now. That definitely couldn't happen. So I guess the question that I'm really posing is, why do we think we need to stay in business, in the business that we're in, if I could put it that way? So what does the business look like now? What do we think it's going to look like? Why do we think it's going to do that? And keeping in mind all of these changes that are not within our control. So we need to start really thinking about what that is. And I know for a lot of people that's scary. People don't like change. It's one reason that the system has stayed in place the way that it has. The academy in particular is likes the status quo a lot, doesn't like to mix things up so much. But again, there's a bunch of things that are happening that are going to really change that. So I was going to be all provocative. I mean, you probably think I'm already have been provocative, but I was going to be all provocative, but then Toby Green did it for me. So I really like this piece by Toby. If you haven't seen it yet, you should. These numbers here were from last week when Layla asked me to give her the slides. As of 1:30 today, this piece had 1,989. I really wanted it to break 2,000, but it didn't. 1,989 views and 583 downloads. But for those of you who have not yet viewed or downloaded it in those numbers, the short version is that there's been a percentage of open access articles are not really, born open access are not really going up. Offsets won't solve the serial crisis. Flipping from a barrier to read to a barrier to publish isn't a better way to go. The reduction in cost is dependent on changing the way that communication is done. Remember, technology, technology, technology. And preprints. What a quaint term that is, by the way. We got to do better than that. What print? What print? But I'm going to argue that preprints are just the technology du jour. It's actually the idea of publishing at will that is intriguing, and I think is intriguing about this piece, but also an intriguing thing to consider. Again, when you're in an environment, as so many are in higher education, where you're needing to talk about productivity, the amount of time it takes to actually go through the publication process really, really curtails your ability to show how productive you are, which is then how you're going to get your annual raise. So going faster, going outside the system, doing something different, whether the way that Toby suggested or some other way, this is going to be an increasing thing that people are going to want to do. And now they can. They can do everything themselves. They might not want to, but they can. Right? So now I'm going to end on a happy note, I promise. Let's return to this call, which is inviting everyone to come and join in the process. But this time, let's all join together. You'll recall that the way the HoloMen ends is not with a bang, but a whimper. I'm going to urge neither a bang nor a whimper, and that we actually figure out how not to have the world end. Thank you.
So, yeah, what I heard in your presentation, and also it's a recurring theme, we have to do the transformation to digital and to the internet area of sharing knowledge. And my question is the internet is not an open sharing place necessarily, but it's a battleground, and there are sort of different sort of ideas battling it out. So it's not necessarily sort of a golden path, only if we make it that way. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, there are a lot of different things I could have said about the technology part, including increasingly privileging, so net neutrality or lack thereof, the digital divide, and the challenges that people may or may not have in terms of even accessing the internet itself. Lots of really interesting work being done in minimal computing in the publishing space to take a look at what's the minimal the thing that you need in order to put something up for people to deal with. Yeah, so one of the, I mean, there are all kinds of inequities and inequalities within the system, of which the technology is a huge, gigantic one. Is that your question? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we also need to work at every level. I think Kathleen's earlier comments about the global nature of all problems that we deal with is a really important thing to keep in mind, including that one. It's like we act like, I mean, and I've always thought that was striking about the BOAI, very rich country approach, because anyone who has access to the internet can access anything. But what if you don't have access to the internet? What does that mean? And it's a real problem. And I don't have a solution. If I did, I'd wave a magic wand.
So David Prosser from Research Libraries UK. Immediate response to that is, okay, so the Budapest Open Access Initiative doesn't address the issue of people who don't have the internet, but it can only solve a certain problem. It doesn't also, what about people who don't have access to electricity? It's not solving that problem. No, of course it's not. It's solving a specific trying to solve a specific problem. And I think that if we try and put too much onto it, it will collapse, because there's only so much you can do. But that wasn't going to be my question, sorry. My question was around, if we're not quite in the place that we wish that we would have been, what do you think that publishers, funders, and librarians should have been doing differently over the past, say, 5 years?
Remember that we are part of higher education rather than, for the most part, rather than part of a research enterprise. So I think what could have been happening all along would be conversations that only now are starting to happen with administrators and so on, because the conversation has been not about how can we create lifelong learners and a public that's really engaged with those things that we're producing. It's been about this has been funded, and I'm not saying that this was not a good argument, but it's been about the work that that has been funded by taxpayer dollars should be made available and so on. And I think that is a fine argument, but not one that really gets to the heart of almost everybody has gone to school, and really, if we can really tap into that. So I would have liked to have seen more of that kind of conversation in the last 5 years, and I think it would also change the conversation that we have about the business of publishing as well. Is this a different kind of business than trade publishing, for example? And should it be? And if it is, how is it different? Why is it different? What kind of conversation can we have around that? I would have liked to have seen that in 5 years. I don't think it's too late to have either of those conversations, though. So I would really like those to start to be the conversations.
So I'm Danny, by the way, from Cambridge, for those of you who don't know me. I go to lots of conferences. I'm involved in lots of conversations. I feel that all we have done in some ways is talk. My husband said to me the other day, I don't understand your job. You just go around to conferences and talk about stuff and nothing changes. So, and so I'm thinking, okay, there's a long list of people there, long list of sort of stakeholders in that list from the invitation in 2003. Where's the block? And what frustrates me is as somebody who's an advocate for open access, is the necessity for me to constantly apologise and constantly be polite to the academic community, because they're all up in arms and upset about everything, and we've got to try and keep them on side and be nice to them so that they don't get even more up in arms about things. And I feel quite strongly that there is a blame, if we're going to talk about blame, laid at the feet of our learned societies who have refused to engage. Discuss.
I think societies are in as much danger as everybody else of not thinking what their business is going to be like. I am part of as part of the introduction that Liz mentioned, one of the projects that I'm working on is Publication Ethics Project, Publication Ethics in Philosophy. In particular, it was inspired by last summer's series of article missteps, let's say that. Let's put it that way. So we did a bunch of focus groups, and one of our members of our team is the executive director of the American Philosophical Association, and really wicked smart, wonderful person. But we had a conversation where we talked to editors, we talked to scholars generally, we talked to publishers, and everybody tried to say it was somebody else's problem, right? So the society should take care of this. The society says, I can't because my members, don't want me telling them what to do. The members say, well, journal editors should take care of that. The journal editors say the publisher should take care of that. The publisher says society. And I think that is also part of this problem, is that nobody actually wants to work on the really hard problems together. And again, I do think that there have been some really great, exciting things that have happened in the last, 10 to 15 years. So it's not like nothing's happening. It feels like nothing to those of us who every day it's incremental. It's and that we're having the same conversations over and over and over and over again. But when we're having those conversations with different people who have never had those conversations, I think that's actually how we get ahead. What are societies going to do? I think some societies will step up and be bold-ish. I think some of them won't. I think some of them, for any number of reasons, have every reason to try to think if we just hold on long enough, the status quo will happen. I'm a great, great believer in societies, though, because they are so disciplinary, cross-cutting. And I think that's where the conversation can be had, should be had. And I certainly do encourage lots of societies to think that way. I think if all of us, particularly those of you who are society publishers, not just surveying what they think, but how can they be part of that conversation, and how can they move things forward?
Since you said discuss, Danny, this is just my experience, but I suspect that others have the same experience. I think there are a growing number of societies that when we as publishers are talking with them, I think partly we've been catalysts to conversations with them about open access and thinking, what are your plans in that direction? But there's a growing number of them that themselves are also saying, as part of the bid, they want to know, how are you going to help us transition to that? So it's been slow, and I agree that was definitely one of the areas that's been really tough, because they too need to have, the journals become the cash cow to keep the rest of the organization running, and to figure out how they too make that transition to continue those good activities. And in some spaces too, where they're funding some tiny, tiny scholarships that no one else would fund, and they're doing it off the back of their journal. So I understand the challenges, but just to say that there is a growing number of them that are specifically asking, help us, talk out loud with us, how do we do this? Some are developing an open access journal alongside their others. Some are saying, okay, can we bring in and have a supplement that's OA? So I think there's more of that today than there certainly was a few years ago.
I totally agree with that. That it's a good conversation, but it needs to be having like 100-fold and 100 times faster, because we're running out of time. I mean, that's the thing, is there's only so much time we have left to keep talking.
Thanks. First of all, thank you, Rebecca, for consulting with me when I was beginning the process of setting up an open access publisher in the humanities at Amherst College. So shout out to Rebecca for her consulting skills. You are awesome. So you wanted provocative questions. Here's one that I'll just leave you with to chew on at the end, that I get a lot actually 10 years or 15 years after your 2003 list of myths. I hear from some institutions now, open access is a business of elites. It's a thing that only elite, well-funded institutions can really talk about. We're not interested. We're a small state university. We have no money. We can't do this. This is really a bunch of elites like Danny who can fly around the world going to meetings. It's not for us. Discuss.
Yeah, this is, I think, the danger of what people think open access is. And again, I put that on us for us collectively, but for going down a route that doesn't actually say there are any number of ways that, depending on depending on the university, depending on the resources that can be allocated, depending on the goodwill and wonderfulness of the people who are working on it. Lauren and I were talking about, so Pitt has been a long-time publisher of open access journals, 40? Is that 40? Most of which don't charge APCs. And it's a totally, it's a way to go, right? So when people think, oh, you have to charge an article processing charge in order to make this work, I think that we've done ourselves a disservice in saying, I can't remember who said yesterday that gold equals money, and I actually, on my slide where I was talking green, I intentionally put dollar bills there too, because green is supposed to be about you don't have to pay any money at all, but gold is just about, I think it was probably Jean-Claude then, gold is just about making it borne away. It's not actually about the money, but it comes down to questions of money. And so in answer to your question, but I think, again, when we're talking about what message we want to send, maybe that we want to make a lot of money out of open access publishing might not be the right approach. Just saying.